And we'll let everybody in. And here we go. And Miriam, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Hello, everybody. Hello, and welcome back. Nice to see you all again. I was just saying a minute ago, and for those who weren't yet in the room, tonight's going to be a little bit less literary. We'll spend a little bit less time in the literature. We will look at something, although we look at some poetry tonight. We will see some videos. They'll take us back to the interwar period. That's going to be what we cover tonight. We'll be talking mostly about the interwar years. Of course, everything we discussed last week will inform tonight's discussion, but that's where we orient ourselves tonight. We orient ourselves between the First and Second World Wars, which, as we'll see, was an extraordinarily creative time for Jews in Eastern Europe, especially in Poland. Let's get into it. By the time we get through World War I, as we saw, and in fact, before we get into it, I'm going to share my screen before I forget to do so. Okay. By the time we get through World War I and several revolutions in Russia, as we discussed last week, starting in 1905 and extending to 1917, and that was the one that really dealt the final blow to the reign of the Tsar and spelled the end of the Russian Empire, the end of the Pale of Settlement. By the time we get through World War I, the map of Europe has shifted once again, as we discussed. One thing that remains the same, the Yiddish. The Yiddish doesn't change. So let's begin there. Last week, we began here. I said, Shalom Aleichem. I asked you to respond, to try responding. Aleichem Shalom. If you don't already know Yiddish, if you know Yiddish already, you're doing well. Shalom Aleichem, Chaverim. Hello, friends. Nochamo, once again, my nomen is Miriam. Ich heiss Miriam. Wie heißt du? And so you'll recall this from last week, I hope. Today, I want to introduce a few more, actually, the responses. Some of the responses to the question, Was machst du? How are you doing? Again, this is review from last week. A couple responses, Gut. Good, yo. Schlecht. Not good. Bad. Nicht kosher. So I'm okay. Not terrible. And the best, Baruch Hashem. Praises God. I want to give you a few more really delicious ways to respond to the question, Was machst du? So first of all, I'm going to introduce a new one. Was macht a Yid? Which means, how's a Jew doing? Because we have to remember that in the mind of the Yiddish speaker, everybody's a Jew. Of course, there are obviously non-Jews living around and among Jews living in Central Europe and Eastern Europe, living among and around Yiddish speakers. But in the imagination, in the Yiddish Ashkenazi imagination, everybody's a Jew. So, was macht a Yid is, how's a Jew doing? In other words, how are you doing? A few different answers. Sehr gut, keine Hore. So it's similar to gut, but sehr gut, very good. And you want to always add keine Hore. If you're a Polish Yiddish speaker, you say keine Hore. The keine Hore means no evil eye, right? We have to remember also, in the imagination of the Yiddish speaker, of the Ashkenazi Jew, it is a very superstitious world where the evil eye is hiding around every bush, waiting to get you. So, sehr gut, keine Hore. Very good, with the qualifier, no evil eye. Another answer, frag nicht, which means don't ask. Frag nicht. Was macht a Yid? Oi, weh is mir, frag nicht. Don't ask. Which is a very classic way to answer the question. It may be. Another one. Was machst du? Oi, weh is mir. Another. Oi, weh is mir. Die Butter is arop. Which literally means the butter is up. The butter is up in the air. What does that mean? Things are a mess. Things are not going well. Things are an absolute tip. Die Butter is arop. The butter is up. So not very good. Another one, a very typical Yiddish answer to "Was macht der Yid" or "Was machst du?" with a shrug, and if you say "Mishlept sich," which means one drags oneself. I'm dragging myself along. I'm muddling through. Mishlept sich. And a final one, this is one my own grandfather would say a lot. He would say, you'd say, "Was machst du? Was macht der Yid?" And he would say, "Melept, Baruch Hashem." I'm living, thank God. I'm living, I'm surviving. I'm living, I'm just living. So these are a few different ways to respond to the question, how you doing? I should also say that the Yiddish speaker, because of this sort of superstitious worldview, Yiddish speaker is almost, you'll notice something also about these responses. They're very indirect. You don't necessarily, as a Yiddish speaker, respond to the question, how are you, directly with, I'm doing great, or not doing well. You use indirect language. And again, this has to do with the evil eye. It has to do with wanting to avoid, if you're doing really well, thank God, Kanai Nahara. You don't want the evil eye to clue into that and maybe take that good situation away from you, right? So you say, "Sehr good, Kanai Nahara," with a qualifier. And so, yeah, indirect language is very much a part of Yiddish communication. By the way, I can certainly make all of these Yiddish phrases available at the end of our course in one document that I can send to Karen, and I'll leave that to Karen to distribute so that you have you can refer back to that whenever you need it. Another favorite of mine, and this I hope becomes a favorite of yours, whenever anybody asks how you're doing, or when simply you want to make a statement about the world, schwer ist das Leben in Golis. Difficult is the life of exile. It is hard to live in exile. It's hard to be a Jew in the world. That's what this means. Schwer ist das Leben in Golis. And I think you will find there are countless applications for this phrase. Schwer ist das Leben in Golis. When you get overcharged at a restaurant, oi, schwer ist das Leben in Golis. It's a difficult existence. What are you going to do about it? Okay. Last week, we talked about the shtetl. Here, the shtetl. Today, we're going to talk more about the shtot. A shtetl is a little town. A shtot is a city. And you maybe hear that you can see and hear that these words are related. The word shtetl is a diminutive form of shtot. It's a small town or a small city. Today, we're going to be talking about the shtot. We're going to be talking about the way when people moved from the shtetl, they moved into the shtot. And we're going to be talking about a few different shtet, a few different cities. We're going to start tonight in Poland. We won't get there tonight, but in the next class, we'll go beyond Poland, the Soviet Union. We'll save that one for next week, and we'll go to America as well. But tonight, we're going to talk about Poland. And here we go. This is a map of the Pale of Settlement. You probably remember this from last week. The shaded areas, the different gradations are indicative of high percentages of Jews living in those areas. So the darker areas are much more concentrated and the lighter areas are much less concentrated. The areas that are much darker are what had been Poland before the partition of Poland, and what becomes Congress Poland again after the First World War. And that's here on the left. And that's where we're going to be centering our conversation tonight. Here is how the map changed. I just said that after World War I, the map of Europe changed. Yet again, this is how it changed. This is just on the eve of the First World War. As we discussed last week, we have the Russian Empire over here, the Austro-Hungarian Empire over here, and over here, the Prussian Empire, which becomes Germany later on. As you can see, Warsaw is subsumed by the Russian Empire. Poland ceases to exist for a period of time, for about 100 years. After the war, this is what the map of Europe looks like, a lot more familiar to us today. And as you can see, Poland is reconstituted. Austria, Hungary become separate countries, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, these places, as you can see, were not on the map before the First World War. They are after the First World War. And this creates a number of changes for the people living in these former empires. Within this new map, several centers of interwar Yiddish emerge, and that's what I want to talk about tonight. And a few things happen. Poland regains its independence and its borders for the first time in almost a century. Within Poland, Warsaw, Lodz, and Vilna become capitals of Yiddish through burgeoning literary and theatrical, political, cultural developments. Berlin becomes something of an expat's paradise in the early 1920s, and we'll go into that a little bit later, and maybe even next week. This is a place where, especially because of the plunging value of currency in Germany, high inflation rates, it is very cheap to live there, to produce work there, to print, and so on. And so it becomes an expat's paradise in some ways. It's also very cosmopolitan, right? The former territories of the Russian Empire are somewhat less. Modernization, urbanization came a little bit later and at a slower pace to the Russian Empire than it did to places in Central Europe. And we have the Soviet Union, which I said we're going to talk about next time, which offers the promise of a new kind of Jewish proletarian culture that is distinct in many ways from what is happening in Poland, what is happening in Germany, what's happening elsewhere. Poland grants Jews full citizenship in 1921. This has to do with the reconstitution of Poland. And despite growing anti-Semitism in Poland and throughout Central Europe at this time, Jews thrive in Poland, and until 1939, constitute the most significant Jewish population in the world. There are youth and religious groups, diverse political parties and Zionist organizations, newspapers and theater flourished. Jews owned land and real estate. They participated in retail and manufacturing and in the export industry. So you can see that life there is very different from the way it had been in the Pale of Settlement. Jewish religious beliefs spanned a range from Orthodox Hasidic Judaism to liberal Judaism to atheism. And political views range just as widely from Polish nationalism to Zionism and everything in between. And of course, there are versions of this on the left, versions on the right. There are leftist Zionists, there are right-wing Zionists, and everything you can imagine. It is a remarkably diverse landscape. There is certainly, I do not want to paint this as a rosy picture, there is certainly discrimination, there is certainly anti-Semitism, there is violence. Jews did not, by and large, benefit from trends toward modernization in the Polish economy, discriminatory policies in public employment, in public works projects, the awarding of credit by central banks. These remained major obstacles to the Jewish economy in Poland. But nevertheless, a growing class of Jewish professionals arose in interwar Poland. Though, of course, you can imagine because of discrimination, the distribution of Jews among professions was not even necessarily. For example, Jewish civil servants, there were not many of them. You could certainly run for political office, but the degree of power that a Jew holding a public office had may differ. Jewish lawyers and physicians tended to engage in private practice because government offices and hospitals would not hire them. So, Jews are sort of living a separate life within Poland, but they're also living a very Polish life. And we'll see that in a minute. And then, of course, for a large segment of Polish Jewry, especially the non-professional class, poverty is a daily fact of life. Money is scarce and it is hard to live there in general. I want to now turn to Jeffrey Chandler, who is a wonderful scholar of Yiddish culture and Polish history. And he's going to give us, we're going to watch a video. He's going to give us a bit of a review on what we talked about last week. And he's going to give us an overview of this new interwar Poland. So here we go. Bear with me while I swap my screen. Okay. And here we go.
Usually when we talk about Jewish life before World War II, and especially in Poland, we're talking about the period between end of World War I, beginning of World War II. And in this period, Poland has the largest Jewish population in Europe, and they are 10% of Poland's population. And the circumstances of Polish Jews are very different from Jews in countries just to the west and just to the east. Jews in Germany are dealing with the rise of Nazism. And, 1933, when Nazis come to power, this whole series of anti-Semitic laws that are being enacted. That's not how things play out in Poland. You can also look just to the east in the Soviet Union. Jews are living under communism. And in order to understand how things play out for Jews in each of these countries, we need to know about those differences. One of the things that is important for us is to think about the situation of Jews as a minority in Poland. And part of this means going back a little bit further in history. If we go back to the Middle Ages, Poland was this very big kingdom. And at the end of the Middle Ages, the early modern period, Poland and Lithuania united and became one of the largest countries in Europe. And it was also one of the most diverse in terms of religion and ethnicities and languages and cultures, and one of the most tolerant. And it was a place where Jews really thrived. In the 18th century, Poland was surrounded by three very powerful states that, as Poland became politically weaker, decided to take the country over, and they partitioned Poland. They took a map of Poland and they said, Russia gets this part, Austrian Empire gets this part, Prussia gets that part, and Poland disappeared from the map. Of course, those people are still there. They're now living as the subjects of these different empires. And then we have World War I. Germany's defeated. The Russian Empire, which had been around for centuries, collapses. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, which had been around for centuries, collapses. And in its place, we have new countries created. They redraw the map of Eastern Europe. There were treaties where the nations of Europe get together, and a very important provision was made in these treaties to protect minority rights, because each one of these countries had a core ethnic and also religious population. Jews were minorities in all of these countries, so protections for minority rights were really important. Poland was one of the most diverse countries then. 1/3 of the population weren't ethnically Poles. In addition to 10% being Jews, there was an even larger percent who were Ukrainians. There were also Germans, there were also Lithuanians, Belarusian. And now everybody was trying to figure out what this new country was going to be. And one of the big tensions was, to what extent was it going to be multicultural? And to what extent was it going to be dominated by its core ethnic religious population of Poles? Part of what's interesting about Jewish life in Poland, it's a remarkably diverse population. There is no single profile of the Polish Jew. Part of it is geographic. Increasingly, Jews live in big cities. They've been urbanizing for some time, but there's still a lot of Jews who live in small towns. There's still a few Jews who live out in the countryside in small villages. And Jews live, on the one hand, side by side with their non-Jewish neighbors, but on the other hand, Jews tend to cluster together for their own purposes. So you have a population that is, on the one hand, very, very connected with their neighbors in some respects, and other respects lead a distinct life. And that is part of what makes it complicated but really interesting, especially now Jews being citizens of the Polish Republic. You could run for office. You could organize your own political parties. You also had obligations you didn't have before, like compulsory education and military service. So all this is very, very new. And figuring out how Jews fit in the mix of that was something new for Jews and something new for Poles. So this is a really interesting generation. This is a generation that was born sometime between 1910 and 1920. So they're growing up in the interwar period. Unlike their parents, they have a whole new set of opportunities that being a citizen of a republic affords you. There are also new challenges that they face that their parents didn't have to deal with. Key issues are education and politics. Coming out of the political parties, something that's very important for young people are youth movements. This is part of a larger flourishing of youth culture in Europe, and the youth movements provided a wide range of activities. And what's key to all of these, whether they were religious or secular or what have you, is they're creating a whole new form of cultural transmission, that children were getting their cultural orientation less from parents and more from their peers in the youth group. And so this is a very important shift in authority and in a sense of community and a sense of belonging that also really didn't exist for Jews in this part of the world before World War I. If we look at them on their own terms, we will bring an important corrective to the way we tend to talk about life before the war, talk about the pre-Holocaust period or the interwar period. That's not a way people living in Poland talked. People aren't living before the war. They're living their lives. They're planning for their futures. Polish Jews aren't obsessed with what's going on in Germany. Germany's Germany. We're in Poland, not our problem. We have issues to deal with. That's not our problem. And it isn't really until, very shortly before the war begins that the idea that Germany's going to invade Poland is on anybody's horizon. So when we look at this period of Jewish life in Poland in the 1920s and the 1930s, on its own, we will see things differently in some important ways than the way we often will encounter them in post-war narratives.
So that is Jeffrey Chandler. I've now introduced you. I recommend that if ever you see he's giving a talk, he talks often about Yiddish culture, attend virtually if you can. He's great. He's fabulous. Right, back to our slides. Okay. So I want to jump right into Poland. And the first stop I want to make is in Vilna. It is called Vilnius today in Lithuanian, Vilna in Yiddish. Vilna is from February 1922 until September 1939, part of northeastern Poland. This is a period marked by incessant tension between Poles and Jews, including the boycotting of Jewish stores every now and then, prohibitions on kosher slaughter every now and then, deliberate discrimination against Jewish students at the local university. This begins in the early 1930s, and even physical attacks that sometimes escalated into pogroms. So like I said, this is not exact. I don't want to paint a rosy picture. I want to paint an accurate picture. The economic status of the city's Jews deteriorated in this period, even as the population grows. In 1921, there are 46,500 Jews living in Vilna. They are 36% of the total population then. By 1939, there are 55,000 Jews living there, and they are 27% of the total population. So the city, too, is growing, not only the Jewish segment. Despite this, the economic status of the city's Jews deteriorated. There's overcrowding, increasing unemployment, and stiff competition, resulting in the closing of workshops and factories. All of this contributed to a rise in the number of those requiring assistance from welfare institutions. So what the interwar period also sees is an increase in that infrastructure, in that social welfare infrastructure. The same one, in fact, that still exists today in many of our Jewish communities, the federation model, right, of social welfare. The roots for that are really grown in this interwar period, when Jews become increasingly dependent on sort of these internal social welfare systems in order to survive. And not only to survive, but to thrive, as we're going to see. of the 55,000 Jews living in Vilna on the eve of the Second World War, 85% of them declare their mother tongue to be Yiddish. So this is a very Yiddish-speaking population. As I said, the one thing that doesn't change when everybody leaves the Pale of Settlement, or when the Pale of Settlement shifts, is the Yiddish language. That remains very strong, and in fact becomes even stronger with the birth of a number of Yiddishist movements being those that are invested in the cultivation and the development of Yiddish culture as a national identity, not only as a linguistic identity or a cultural one, but as actual, a sense of national belonging to the Yiddish people. Okay. This, by the way, I wanted to show you this photo from the Jewish quarter of Vilna. Vilna was famous for these very distinctive arches, which actually appear. There were a number of publishing houses, Yiddish publishing houses, that opened in the early 1900s in Vilna. The Boris Kletzkin Press was one of them. If you open sort of a book of classic Yiddish literature, you might find from around the 1920s, you might find that it was published by the Kletzkin Press in Vilna, and the publisher's mark, the little logo of the Kletzkin Press, is what is these Vilna arches. They're very, very distinctive and particular to the Jewish quarter. Despite the instability and the uncertainty of living in Vilna in this period, or maybe actually because of it, Vilna rises to prominence as a rival to Warsaw, which we'll explore in a minute, in terms of its Jewish cultural significance and impact. You may have seen, I'll go back a slide, Jerusalem of Lithuania. This was the nickname given to Vilna. It was given to Vilna because of the presence in the 1700s of the Vilna Gaon, the genius of Vilna, the preeminent Jewish scholar who founded a yeshiva there and really made Vilna a center for excellence in Jewish learning. Yeshiva students flocked there from all over Poland and all over Europe in order to study at the famed yeshivot of Vilna. Vilna was a place where the Misnagdim thrived. You're familiar with the debate between the Hasidim and the Misnagdim. These are the Hasidim and then the people who opposed. That's what a Misnagid is, one who opposes Hasidism. The Misnagdim, the seat of the Misnagdim was really in Vilna. They emphasized Talmud study and textual prowess and things like that. Hasidism had other things in mind. Vilna sort of gains its reputation as a result of being this a place of very serious Jewish learning, and that's how it gets the nickname the Jerusalem of Lithuania. In Yiddish, they call it Yerushalayim de Litte. In part of this, I would call it this pride, a real pride in Vilna as a place of learning, is even among the secular Jews, the development of various institutions. So Vilna is famous for the Strashun Library, this beautiful library that full of Jewish books that people frequented all the time. In 1925, we're looking at a photo of the YIVO building. The YIVO stands for the Yiddische Wissenschaftliche Institut, the Institute for Jewish Research, founded in 1925 in Vilna. It's founded by various academics in Berlin and Vilna. They are discussing, where is the best place for this capital of such a prestigious institution of Jewish scientific research, and by which they mean real analytical academic research, not necessarily the sciences. In fact, all knowledge, history, linguistics, sociology, economics, you name it, folklore especially. They decide Vilna because of this sort of legendary status of Vilna as a place of Jewish learning. What I want to do now is I would like to take a moment to watch this really fascinating video. It is from 1939. There were a series of travelogues made about 6 different Yiddish or very Jewish cities in Yiddish. This one has, I believe, an English voiceover, a translation of the original Yiddish. These were made really for export to the American market, actually. As I say, they're made in 1939 when, as we just heard Jeffrey Chandler say, it's not exactly clear that a war is coming to wipe all of this away. The situation is certainly precarious and has been for some time. There are problems. Like we said, there is a ton of poverty. These films were generally made for export to the American market in order to fundraise, essentially, to gain the sympathy of American audiences, and to try to get some more money coming their way. So the footage, it's a little grainy. It is 1939, and it's grainy, but we'll watch a few minutes of it, and I think you will enjoy. So here we go.
Historical records show that there was Jewish settlement in Vilna at the beginning of the 16th century. In the 17th century, it became famous as a place of Torah learning and later earned the title Jerusalem of Lithuania. The old nucleus of the city is the Fortress Hill, on which stands the castle of the city's founder, Prince Gedimin of the 14th century. Adam Mickiewicz Street, named after Poland's national poet who lived in Vilna. Fortress Street, a street which cuts the center of the city and leads to the municipal park, named after the Bernardine Order. This is an ancient street, built like most of the old streets in Vilna in the style of the Renaissance. The cathedral, the city's central church, stands in a broad square between the city's two municipal parks, the Bernardine and the Talatnik. The old university, named after King Stefan Batory, was founded in 1578. Some 4,000 students attend the university, among them more than 1,000 Jews, mostly in the faculties of law, philosophy, and the humanities, because of restrictions against Jews studying in other faculties such as medicine. The municipality building, one of the few in Europe in whose yard may still be found firemen with carts and horses. The Municipal Theater, Reduta. Its company includes some of Poland's best actors who have been attracted to the special artistic atmosphere of Vilna. The Jewish Quarter, which extends across several blocks in the center of the city. The old cemetery. This is the grave of the Vilna Gaon. Not far from him is buried the convert to Judaism, Prince Potocki, who became a Jew in 1749 and was burned at the stake for it. The yard of the famous synagogue, the Schulhof. Here are more than 20 different synagogues, study centers, schools for all kinds of trades, such as those of societies of tailors, painters, shoemakers, and even that of the gravediggers. In the middle stands the great synagogue built in 1573. The old Beit HaMidrash, the first building in the synagogue yard. The clocks show the times for prayers, the beginning and end of the Sabbath, the time for lighting candles. This is the entrance to the study house of the Vilna Gaon, and here is the charitable fund. Also in the synagogue yard is the Strashun Library. It was opened in 1902. The library is considered a center of Jewish learning because of the rare treasures of literature stored on its shelves. The heart of the Jewish ghetto consists of a network of narrow streets and alleys. The most important are the Street of the Glaziers and the Street of the Butchers. Here, thousands of Jews in Vilna are born. Here they create and live full lives. The Gaon Street. In one of these dark houses, the Gaon, Rabbi Eliyahu, was born. In the second half of the 18th century, the Gaon's personality and activities made their imprint on Jewish Vilna, and his circle of students influenced all Jewry in the sphere of halakha and Kabbalah. Under the Gaon's influence, Vilna became the center of opposition to Hasidism. Most of the ghetto's commerce is conducted in the street. Here, men deal in salt herring, a small bunch of kindling wood, or a dozen rusty nails. Poverty isn't a shame, they say in Vilna, but it also isn't one of the most comfortable things in the world. The market women call out their wares. Here in Vilna, the women have a special talent for praising their merchandise, which sells for pennies to buyers who are far from choosy. Here one hears Lithuanian Yiddish, the juicy Mamaloshen, with all its idioms. Yiddish is spoken by all the Jews in Vilna, from the carter to the banker. This language serves the Jews of Vilna not only as a means of expression, but is connected to every aspect of Jewish life in the city.
Okay, I'm going to stop it there for the sake of time. You can Google this and watch it to the end. Simply Google Jewish life in Vilna, and this should come up. Some of the strongest literary voices of the era were the members of Young Vilna, who we see here. Jeffrey Chandler in that first video mentioned the explosion of youth culture. It is not an overstatement. This is that first generation sort of coming of age during World War I. So the world they then enter and remake is essentially starting from scratch as they know it. Young Vilna is this collective of poets. They're young poets, all of them. They are from the city of Vilna and its surrounding townlets. They are united by a commitment to freedom of expression, artistic experimentation, and a collective concern for the social, political, and cultural life of the city. Like I say, this is one prime example of youth culture. Of course, there were youth organizations organized around sports and around politics. This one is organized around literature. So for the purposes of Yiddish, this becomes really important. The genius of these poets was that they took Vilna, this mythical and ancient Jewish city, and they refashioned it in modern terms. And what I mean by that is that they mapped onto it the concerns of the moment. You know, how the past would inform the present, what the future would look like, how they could have a hand in shaping that future. This was of real concern to these poets. Also breaking all the old rules of art and literature and remaking the world that had been destroyed as far as they were concerned. What I want to do, and I just want to take about 10 minutes to do this, so it's going to be fast, but what I'd like to do is I want to share with you, some of you may already have a couple of poems that I believe Karen emailed out today. Just in case you don't, what I will do is, I'll stop my share for just a minute. What I will do is in the chat box, just in case you don't already have this, I will drop a PDF of that document there. There it is. If you open the chat, you should see it. If you click on it, it should download to your computer and you should be able to open it. If you do have it printed out, even better. What I want to do is take about 10 minutes and break you into breakout rooms, smaller groups, so that you'll have a chance to read these poems together as a group and think about them a little bit. And what I've done is provided a couple of guiding questions to help orient what are going to be very brief discussions, and that's on purpose. So let me go ahead and do that. And there should be roughly 6 to 7 participants in each room. I will I will keep an eye on the time, and I will end the breakout rooms when 10 minutes have elapsed. Do your best, at the very least, to just read through the 2 poems, and they're only excerpts of longer poems, so do your best and have a good time. And I look forward to reconvening in just a few minutes. And when you see the invitation to join the breakout room, please go ahead and join one. Hi, everybody, as you come out of your rooms and back into this one. I see everybody coming back in now. This is great. Okay, excellent. I hope that was interesting. I hope you had a chance to have, if not a robust conversation, a read at least of these two poems. I hope you'll see they're very different in tone, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. First, I want to start with, and Karen, just to give you a heads up, I think we'll go till about 8:40, 8:45, and then we'll stop for some questions, if that's okay.
Sounds great.
Okay, excellent. Right. I want to talk first about the first poem you read by Moshe Kulbak called Vilna, which of course is a poem about the city. The thing is, in many ways, this is not so much a poem about the city than as it is a love poem to Vilna itself, to the city. Kulbak wrote this after returning to Vilna from Berlin. He was from Vilna. As I said, Berlin became one of these expats' paradises, and many Yiddish writers ended up going to Berlin to take advantage of the burgeoning Weimar culture, the interwar culture going on there, the high inflation rate, which made it very cheap to live there, and so on. Moshe Kulbak was one of those. Some of his most prolific writing actually comes out of his time in Berlin, which is very brief, just a couple of years. He writes this poem upon returning to Vilna. So his perspective is that it's a little bit romantic. It's that of one who has returned home, who's been away and come home, not just to any home, but to a vibrant, dynamic, immersive Jewish home, which is so different, of course, in so many ways from cosmopolitan Berlin, where there are Jews, of course, but as Jeffrey Chandler said, it's a very different kind. The city that Kulbak describes, and I think you see this in his language, the city is ancient, it's mythological, it is transcendent in some ways. It holds the essence of centuries of Jewish life. There's the interplay in his poem between the religious and the secular. He describes the city as a psalm, a prayer, a hymn. There's gray writing, whatever that means. He describes the city and its streets as a book, parchment, pages, right? So there you have the interplay between religious and secular books, religious and secular writing, religious and secular thought. But the glory of the city, the way Kulbak describes it, is in its decay, actually. It's aging, it's peeling, it's gray, it's mossy, it's fading away like the pages of an old Siddur, essentially. It's in decline, but it's still sacred in that way. But by the end of the poem, and I really only gave you an excerpt, there are several parts. I think there are 6 parts to the poem, so I've plucked out a few choice pieces. By the end of it, the poet is energized by the conflicts between young and old that he first lays out in the beginning of the poem. Between the fresh and the decaying, between tradition and modernity, this is what gives him energy. And of course, at the end of the poem, he finds that Yiddish, the Yiddish language, is the solution to all of this, right? Yiddish is homely, and Yiddish is gray, so it's old, and yet it is twinkling, right? There's something magical about the Yiddish language. It's the salve that will soothe all these divisions and put them in productive tension with one another. That's what Yiddish can do. That's the power of Yiddish in a place like Vilna. The traditional Jew walking the rooftops in a talit from the very beginning of the poem, the young secular writer who reads David Bergelsen, the political activist, the Bundist, all of these become united in a place like Vilna under this banner of Yiddish. Okay, so that's some commentary on the first poem. The reason I gave you the second poem is because these really need to be read together. The second poem, called Vilna Schulhof, which we saw in the film, the courtyard, the synagogue courtyard in Vilna, that is actually a response to Kulbak's poem. You'll see it was written a couple of years later. It's written as a response by Lazer Wolf, who's another one of these members of this Jung Vilna collective. And he's responding to Moshe Kulbak. He's saying, Moshe Kulbak, you have traveled to one of Europe's most cosmopolitan cities. You have left Vilna, you've had a wonderful experience. You view Vilna from the rooftops, you view Vilna from above, from a distance, where the city is transcendent. But Laser Wolf, who has never left Vilna, he feels claustrophobic in a place like Vilna. He feels contained in that place. So his gaze is toward the cramped synagogue courtyard, right? It's toward the physical and the spiritual decline of its inhabitants, the people who live there, not the transcendent people, the people who actually live their daily lives there. And what he sees in his poem are empty tzedakah boxes. And there's nothing sadder than an empty tzedakah box. A hungry chazan. He's effectively saying, okay, so what? We live in a cultural capital. Big deal. You know, you in Berlin, you might, that's nice for you to idealize and romanticize, but you know, here we're poor and starving, and culture, you can't eat culture, right? So he has a harsh realist perspective. And what he does is the same way that the first poem really elevates the myth of Vilna as a city, here he really subverts that, right? So for this poet, for Wolf, that myth of the city is old, it's outdated, it's irrelevant. Instead, you have this I can't even say it. He demythologizes the city. There we are. And he turns our gaze instead, not to the transcendent, but to the grotesque, to the desacralized, you know, that which should be holy, but somehow is bereft of its holiness. You know, he talks about Moses Montefiore, who was this 19th century banker who interceded with the Russian authorities on behalf of Jews. You know, his portrait hangs above that of the Vilna Gaon, which really tells you something. You know, he suggests that the myth of Vilna as a central and traditional site of Jewish learning is actually secondary to the material well-being of the city's inhabitants, which is very poor. So, you know, what he's arguing for is, and this really gets to one of those key discussions that I mentioned, you know, that this collective of Young Vilna is having about the city and what it means to live in this city at this moment of this modern moment. What does it mean to live in an ancient city, a magical city in this moment of disillusionment, right? And what he's arguing for is engage with the moment, not the myth. You know, the myth is very nice. We need to focus on the moment. We need to focus on the survival of the people who live here right now. Okay, so that's a snapshot of Vilna. Let me go back and share my screen. Okay, so here we go. That's the myth of Vilna. And I think Young Vilna really captures that myth in really special ways. I want to take a few minutes and move to Warsaw. Warsaw, as we know, is a major city for Jews in the interwar period. Warsaw, of course, is the capital of Poland. It makes it a very complex place. It makes it a very populous place, a very diverse place. Between the 1860s and the 1880s, the Jewish population tripled, in fact. And remember, this is still when, between the 1860s and 1880s, this is still part of the Russian Empire. Jews no longer wanting to live in the constricted sort of area of the smaller places in the Pale, they flock to the city. They flock to Warsaw. They want modernity. They want what's there. Of course, there's still restrictions in this period, but the population grows. And by 1914, by the First World War, 337,000 Jews are living in Warsaw. That is 10% of the whole population of Warsaw. And Warsaw then becomes the largest Jewish center in Poland, as we know, by the time we get to 1939. Mostly, I want to say that the reason we have this enormous population growth, it's because of internal migration, right? We have Jews migrating from other parts of the Russian Empire to Warsaw.
How do you pronounce Warsaw in Yiddish?
Great question. Warszawa. Warsaw is Warszawa. Thanks for asking. Yeah. People are drawn to the city because of modernization, industrialization, the things that draw people to cities in this period, right? And the social economic benefits that those things afforded. There are a number of influential writers living in the city in that 1880s period, mostly publishing in actually Hebrew newspapers. This is before the real cultural awakening of Yiddish. Later on, they're publishing in Yiddish newspapers. And of course, our old friend Yudlamid Peretz, who we met last week, one of the Klassiker, the classic Yiddish writers, he arrives in Warsaw in 1891. So during the Russian Empire, the period of the Russian Empire. After the Tsarist authorities revoked his law license, he had been practicing as a lawyer. They revoked his law license and denounced him as a radical, which gave him plenty of time to pursue his writing, which he had always done, but it was always secondary to his law practice. He becomes the leading literary figure. He really becomes a major celebrity. And his home he has two different apartments in Warsaw in the period he lives there, which is from 1891 onward until his death in 1915. His home, both of his homes, become literary salons. They become gathering spaces for a whole new generation of writers who come to worship at the feet of the great Yiddish writer Yudlamid Peretz. It's a modest home that he lives in, just a 2-bedroom apartment with a small study and a small kitchen, but it became sort of the unofficial center of Poland's new wave of Jewish writers, this new generation coming of age during the waning days of the Russian Empire and the years of the revolution, and then coming into their adulthood during the new period of Congress Poland in the 1920s and 30s. When Peretz arrives in Warsaw in 1891, the city is emerging as this teeming Jewish metropolis and the center of Yiddishkeit that it eventually becomes. It's just emerging then in the 1890s. And he's sort of in the center of it all. He is near a whole courtyard of synagogues. He is 2 blocks away, there's Krochmalna Street, which is sort of brothels and small traders that later Isaac Bashevis Singer would write his novels about, sort of an underworld. All this stuff, you sort of have the synagogue and the brothel. You have these things almost colliding in a place like Warsaw that is so dense, that is so full of people, and more coming every year. It's an extraordinarily dynamic and exciting place for a young person, and Peretz's home really becomes the center of this little universe. I want to take a minute and talk about newspapers. Newspapers become such a big deal, especially in the early 1900s. This is what I'm showing you here is actually one of the panels of an exhibit that I did in 2017 at the University of Toronto, an exhibition on Yiddish culture and Yiddish language. I talked about the Yiddish press, and here's what I said about it. I'll read, it's very small, so I'm going to read it to you. The Yiddish press was one of the most influential forces in Jewish political and cultural life of the early 20th century. Mass migration, beginning in the late 1800s, dispersed communities on an unprecedented scale. But wherever Jews went, the Yiddish press was there. Correspondents spanned the globe, from the farthest reaches of Eastern Russia to the Horn of South Africa and across the Atlantic to South America, engaging the Yiddish-speaking world in a lively and avid discussion of the economic, political, and cultural issues of the day. Okay, that's a snippet of what that says. And the fact is that Yiddish newspapers were some of the most widely read pieces of Yiddish print. It is often where readers encountered Yiddish literature. We're not talking about people like Yudlamid Peretz publishing books. That happens later after his death. His work becomes collected in books and issued that way. Most people are consuming his literature and the literature of Sholem Aleichem and the literature of Mendel Merchosforen and a host of other writers. They're encountering them as serialized, snippets in the Yiddish press. So the Yiddish press is really important, not only for distributing news, but also for distributing culture. And I want to show you, this is what the entire exhibition case looked like. Here we have Heint, and here we have Der Moment. These are the 2 leading Warsaw Yiddish papers. Here's a close-up so you can see what the sort of overwhelming, overcrowded front page looked like. This is what it looked like. Heint published in Warsaw from 1908 to 1939. And this is what it looked like pretty much consistently. This is from 1930. I want to spend the last couple of minutes tonight talking about the avant-garde, because literature certainly is a part of this, but so is art, part of this burgeoning new scene of culture happening by and for Polish Jews. So the years following the First World War, as you may know from art history, from this is a global phenomenon, right? The sort of reimagining of the world after World War I. It's an extraordinarily productive time in the arts around the world, and Poland is no exception, absolutely. Jung Wilno is one example, as we just saw, these collectives of young poets. There are others, of course, including Jung Yiddish, and that's the group that puts out this journal we're looking at right now in 1919 in Łódź. There's Chaliastre, which means the gang, and we'll talk about them in a second. What we're looking at here, this is Jung Yiddish was the first avant-garde modernist group to organize in Poland. They organized in Łódź, like it says, in 1919. What they did was they combined, and this is really key, this really captures the mood of the era. They combined poetry and the plastic arts. Mixing, and this is how one critic put it, he said, folkish Yiddishkeit with the latest word from the Moscow poetic bohemia. In other words, there are a number of changes happening in the artistic and literary world. They're happening, many of them are driven by what's happening in the Soviet Union, this entirely new way of life under communism, which is not all bad, certainly not all bad for Jews, at least in the beginning. The 1920s and the early 30s are, as we're going to see next week, are a really exciting time for Jews to be in the Soviet Union, some Jews. And what happens is you have the development of these really small, really energetic groups, creative groups. Each of them is very short-lived. They only last a couple of years because of artistic differences. They tend to break up very quickly. They each produced manifestos, which stated their visions, not only for art, but for literature, for culture, for the world at large. They promoted themselves through articles in journals like this one, which I should add is printed on packing paper. That's part of the creative revolutionary spirit, is not to sort of kowtow to the expectations for high art and literature of the old expectations, to break free of those chains. And if you want to print a journal on packing paper, go for it. So that's what they do, this particular journal. They promote themselves through articles in journals, through provocative poetry recitals, through exhibitions. And though poetry is central to their causes, these groups were not strictly literary, as I've been saying. The cultural landscape following the First World War encouraged breaking boundaries, forging new paths, a fluidity between the literary arts and the visual arts. Visual artists and poets frequently collaborated, especially in the production of these periodicals, like the ones we're looking at, which were always both literary and artistic. That was the goal. It was a combined goal. And the art and the poetry of these journals spoke in the language of expressionism, which is a movement, of course, that comes after the First World War. It's a movement that emerges from the ruins of violence and destruction and revolution, and it reflects those energies. In other words, it's experimental. It centers on themes of alienation and pessimism as art, as a means of regaining one's sanity in a world like this, of holding on to some semblance of sanity. Languages and images in these journals are dynamic, they are radical, and they're intended to sort of weaponize language and images to sort of liberate the literary space, right? It's radical. I want to show you the Chaliastre that I mentioned, the gang. You might know some of these names we're looking at from the left: Mendel Elkin, Peretz Hirschbein, Uritzfried Greenberg, Peretz Markish, with that crazy hair in the middle, that distinctive hair, Melech Ravitch, who actually ended up moving to Montreal and living out his days in Montreal after the war, and I.J. Singer, the older brother of Isaac Bashevis Singer. And this is 1922. This is this gang of radicals. I want to show you their manifesto, and I can certainly read it in Yiddish. Mir Jungen, mir Freilchet, zungene Chaliastre, mir gehen in einen unbewussten Weg, in tiefe, meure, scheure, dicke Tag, in Nacht von Schreck, per aspera and ad astra. We, the young, a happy, boisterous gang, we're trotting on an unknown path through deeply melancholic days, through nights of fright, and then per aspera ad astra, Latin for through hardships to the stars. This comes from a poem published in that first journal I showed you in 1919. This becomes really the credo of the group, that they are a happy, boisterous gang here to mix things up. And I want to end with just to mention that, of course, Warsaw, Vilna, these are not the only places where this dynamic movement in Jewish culture is happening. This is the one issue of the Chaliastra's journal. This is another issue just a couple years later, published in Paris. These people are moving across Europe. Paris becomes a place of art and training. People go there to train in the arts. Berlin, like I said, becomes another place, and people move very seamlessly between these places to and from. Marc Chagall designed this cover. Here are another two covers of a journal. This one's called Albatross. And you can see there's this, they're playing with layout, they're playing with type, they're playing with font, and they're playing with images in ways that really do feel radical. I mean, considering this is the 1920s, right? Jigen and Schumacher, you've probably heard of them. They not only were the biggest comedic duo for decades in Poland, they come from Lodz, both of them, and they toured all over Europe. They also, after the war, they both survive in the Soviet Union, and they end up being an act in Israel too. Schumacher, this one, dies fairly early on, and Jigen continues on his own, a solo show, and they are, I recommend their records, I recommend their films. They are a riot. They're also part of this sort of satirical performance, comedy. They based a lot of their work in the stories of Shalom Aleichem. So they're digging into the folklore of the Jewish past and bringing that to the present. They're also part of this movement in the performing arts. And of course, there is film. These are just two of the films, the Yiddish films coming out of Poland in this time. Yidel mitten Fiedel, 1936, starring Mali Pican, and Der Dibuk, which remains sort of an exemplary piece of expressionistic cinema. That's 1937, and the Dibuk, you can certainly see, I believe you can get both of these. If you need help finding them, let me know and I can help you. These are both in Yiddish. They're both subtitled, so it is easy to follow along. And I think we'll end there for tonight. Bis bald, which means see you soon. Until next time. And I would love to take some questions and get some reactions. So please.
There's one question in the chat. Alex is asking, what is Chaliastra?
Oh, Chaliastra, it's a word, it means the gang. And the gang is this, the name of one of these literary collectives of young people who are really shaking things up in the literary scene in Poland.
So if you have questions, you can either type them in the chat. I see you, Marcia, hang on a sec. Type them in the chat or raise your hand electronically. It's easier to see you that way. Or you can wave your hand and I will try and keep an eye on people. So Marcia, you have a question, and then Annie.
As far as I understand, in Warsaw, the Jewish community was quite assimilated. They were quite secular, and they didn't speak much Yiddish, at least not outside. Am I right, or there is some truth to that?
Certainly there's some truth to that. I think what happened in Poland was there was a huge push for what they call Polonization. The idea, to become Polish, to enroll your children, your Jewish children, not in Jewish schools where they're only going to learn Yiddish and, Jewish material, but to broaden their horizons, to enroll them in Polish schools. And education is something that really expands. Both Jewish education and Polish education more generally expands in this period too. And absolutely, there are plenty of Jews most Jews, I would say, in Poland are using Polish in their daily lives for the most part. But I mean, almost without exception, although they are assimilated in the sense that they are secular, Yiddish is the Mamaloshin. Yiddish is what people know from home. Whether they choose to use it in the street is something different. For example, my grandfather, who was born in 1914 in Koński in Poland, ended up growing up in Lodz. He had he was the youngest of many children, and one of his older sisters had a baby when he was just a teenager. And what he would say was that her name was Gittel, and she was a beautiful baby. And when she learned to speak, she only spoke Polish. And that was like a real wow, you know? So I think it depended on the family, certainly. There's also a really large Hasidic population. I don't know the numbers, but certainly Hasidism really took off in Poland in ways that it didn't quite take off in the same way in the Russian Empire. In the eastern part, in Poland, Hasidism really took off. And this is something that starts in the early 1800s and goes, I mean, until today. So yeah, I mean, it's a very diverse population. Warsaw being the capital is a real example, a shining example of the diversity. You have everybody from across the board. I hope that's a reasonable answer for now.
Thank you.
Sure. Great question.
Annie, you're next.
Yes, thank you. Just a question about the migration of the Jews from the small villages and the shtetls to the large cities. Does this mark the end of all the shtetls that we knew from Tevye's time?
That is a fabulous question. You know, yes, in large part, yeah. And so much of the literature, for example, that people who leave the shtetl, these young writers are people who have left the shtetl and come to the city and grown up in the city. So much of the writing they do, they go back to the old shtetls, which are really on their last legs by the 1920s. And they're going back, well, they're really on their last legs by before World War II, actually. World War I, I'm sorry, because World War I comes and a lot of those shtetl are on the front. And so the shtetl really are wiped out. People flee, people are killed, people seek safety elsewhere. And so the shtetl, the ones that survive the war, become the subject of nostalgia, you know, whatever's left of them. People go back and do ethnographies and collect information about the people who live there. They write novels about them. They write short stories about them, some satirical and some not. So yeah, for the most part, what these writers are doing and artists are doing is documenting a world that is rapidly disappearing. It's mostly gone by the time we get to the 1920s because of war, revolution, violence, the redrawing of those borders, and the mass migration to the cities. Urbanization is a real feature of this period too.
Right. Thank you.
Sure.
And Dana is next.
Not a question, but a comment. This has been amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I grew up with a Bissel Yiddish from my mother, who had more Yiddish from her grandmother. My mom's actually here.
Oh, great.
Anyways, in the beginning of this evening, there were some fantastic phrases. And as you kept introducing more and more of them, I kept thinking of, now not everybody's watched it, Shtizel, but I watched it now 3 times. And the only reason I'm watching it is for the Yiddish.
Yeah.
And the translation of it is horrific. If you know any Yiddish or Hebrew and you're watching it, you're like, that's not what they said. But for the most part, it's not bad. But it is a joy to hear the Yiddish. And now that you have just introduced all these sayings, I'm like, oh my God. So thank you. And I can't wait to have those sayings and phrases. I will pass them on to my mom.
Excellent. Oh, I think that's fantastic. Yeah. And it's a list you can always build upon, right? There are
very helpful. Yes.
That's great.
I'm partial to a few of them. So thank you very much.
I'm so glad.
I can't wait for next week. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Likewise.
There's a question in the chat. Is there an interest for younger people now to learn Yiddish?
Yes, it is quite remarkable. There has been a real renaissance. There's a new app, a language learning app called Duolingo, where you can learn Yiddish on the app. That's making huge strides right now. That's really plunging Yiddish into the 21st century in a big way. But yeah, more and more universities are offering Yiddish courses, Yiddish language courses, Yiddish culture courses. There are summer programs around the world. The best one is probably these days in Tel Aviv. If you ever have the chance, if you have a month you can dedicate, it always happens in July through August, or July to, or I should say the month of July. It's 1 month long and it's an intensive Yiddish course. It is fabulous. And it's for learners of all levels. I really recommend it. If you can't make it that far, there's one in New York at YIVO. I think it's a 6-week course. Yeah, there are, and online courses. In the last year of the pandemic, Yiddish has actually really expanded in incredible ways. It's an international, transnational community, right? There are people who speak Yiddish and are interested in Yiddish all over the world. And something this pandemic has opened all of our eyes to is, the online possibilities when we are isolated, right? And there's a Yiddish open mic every Sunday that broadcasts that's hosted in Scotland, actually, and so a lot of British Yiddish speakers in that one. There are lectures happen and presentations happening all the time. That's something I actually I was going to save that till the end of our next session, but I'll tell you now, and I'll give you more information later too. YIVO that I mentioned from 1925 in Vilna, YIVO survived the war. YIVO's headquarters are now in New York on West 16th Street. They are the largest repository of Eastern European Jewish life in the world. They're an incredible archive. They offer a number of online courses on Ashkenazi Jewish culture. They're on Yiddish culture. They're not in Yiddish language, but they are certainly on Yiddish culture. Those are free to register for through August this year. I don't work for them. I'm just a fan. So I recommend them if you want to register. And the Yiddish Book Center, which is an incredible place. It's in Amherst, Massachusetts. If YIVO is the largest repository of Jewish archives, the Yiddish Book Center is the largest repository of Yiddish books. They collect Yiddish books. They don't only collect them, they translate them. They offer workshops in translation. They have been doing a whole number of public talks during this pandemic. So yeah, there's plenty of chances to hear Yiddish lectures in Yiddish, in fact, to attend a Yiddish class, attend a Yiddish culture class. It has been a really special time for the really development of Yiddish, led by young people younger than me, people 10 years younger than me. It's really, really special. Yiddish is relevant to a whole new generation, and it's really a really beautiful thing to see.
That's wonderful. I about 10 years ago, maybe more, a book about how the Yiddish Book Center got started and how I think it was the efforts of one person going around the States in an old van or car or something collecting
That's it.
books. I don't remember the name of the book, but it's a really good read.
I'll put the title in the chat. It is an incredible read. It makes me cry every time I read it, and I keep going back and I read it anyway. It's called Outwitting History. By Aaron Lansky, who's the guy who founded the book center when he was, I think, 24 years old. He was a graduate student at McGill studying Yiddish literature and realized he and his colleagues were studying off of photocopies. They didn't have books. And so he put out a call for Yiddish books, and the number kept growing. I think in 6 months, he had 1 million books, even though experts at the time said there were probably only this is in the early 80s. I think experts at the time said there were probably about 70,000 extant Yiddish books that he could possibly collect. And I think within 6 months or within a year, he had like 1 million, and just had to find bigger and bigger warehouses. And I'll let you read the book to hear the rest. They're reopening. They've been closed for the pandemic, of course. The website is wonderful and robust with all kinds of resources. I'll share that with you. And they're reopening their doors. I just read today on June 24th. So take a road trip. When the border opens, get in the car and drive to Amherst. It is well worth it. Yeah.
Thanks. There's a couple more hands up.
Sure.
Alex and then Peter.
I just wanted to make a comment. I had the privilege when I was living in Argentina of going through high school in a technical school called ORT. ORT happens to be an international organization founded in Russia in 1880, I believe. And its whole purpose at the time was to prepare the Jews from shtetls to have a profession to be able to live in the cities, because the Pale was, not disintegrating, but it was dying effectively for them. And that little school of trades at the time became one of the largest Jewish institutions of learning across the world. It's a fascinating story what happened there.
how amazing that you got to go to high school kind of in that aura. What an incredible thing. And Argentina too, Buenos Aires was an incredible center for post-war Yiddish. I'll talk next time we meet about post-war Yiddish as well. As you know, I don't have to tell you, but maybe everyone else here needs to know, Buenos Aires was one of the major centers for Yiddish publishing after the war. There was this incredible series of 100 books called the Musterwerk collection, edited by a guy called Shmuel Rojansky. Between 1958 and 1984. So this was a decades-long project. He published all the great works of Yiddish literature, and it was just a tremendous undertaking, and all of it came out of Buenos Aires. So Buenos Aires is certainly one of those places that the legacy of Jewish life there, Yiddish life after the war, remains a huge presence in Yiddish studies today. It's a really special place with a really special history. I think there's a new book out on Yiddish newspapers, I think, in Buenos Aires. There's all this new research coming out of
That was was the most famous newspaper in Yiddish.
Right. Yeah. And I think there's a brand new book or something. I'll have to find it. Yeah. But absolutely. We'll talk about that next time. And I thank you so much for sharing that. That is a remarkable thing.
And one more question, Peter.
I'm wondering, you've referred a number of times to the Jewish quarter of Warsaw and also Vilna, but where does the term ghetto come from? And I mean, we know there was a Warsaw ghetto.
Mhm.
Was there a ghetto elsewhere? Well, I know that there was a ghetto elsewhere, but what is the effect of it?
It's a very good question. Ghetto, of course, comes from the Italian. It comes from the Italian ghetto in Venice, right, where Jews were actually limited to a certain area of the city from the 1500s. So it's a very, very old word that is not really, comes back into play really in the sense that we know it, certainly during the Second World War. But I don't know if, I can't say for sure whether people tend to, and I'm thinking about everything I've read in Yiddish and how do Yiddish speakers actually refer to the Jewish neighborhoods? They call it der Yiddische Gass, right? In der Yiddische Gass, which is in the Jewish street. They call it the Jewish street, by which they mean the sort of the populous Jewish neighborhoods. Ghetto really just refers to a place that is densely packed, sort of with defined borders. You know, I don't really think it is so much a part of how Jews think of how they're living in interwar Poland and in interwar, you know, in interwar cities. It's not, it's der Yiddische Gass. It's the Jewish street. It's the Jewish neighborhood, you know, and I think that's really, it's an excellent question, and I don't have a good answer. In fact, I'm thinking about it now. I'll have to look into it. When ghetto really becomes part of, gains more currency. It's a great question. I don't think it's in this period. That's not something, it's not the first thing that occurs to me. The Yiddische Gass is the thing that occurs to me. These neighborhoods where Jews were very populous, where the Jewish stores were located, where the Jewish businesses were located, where the synagogue was located, things like that. Of course, Jews lived everywhere, but there are places where they're, you know, more dense.
Thanks. I don't see any more hands or anything in the chat. So, and
I have a quick question.
Oh yeah, sure. Go ahead.
I'm just curious about your background, Miriam, with all the Yiddish writing. What is that Yiddish writing on your background screen?
Oh, my actual background.
Yes.
This comes from the archive of Chava Rosenfarb, who was a Polish writer. She got her start in the 1920s in this exact milieu that I've been describing. She survived the war. She was in Auschwitz. She was in a number of camps. She survived the war and ultimately made her way to Montreal, where she lived and continued to write in the 1950s, 60s, 70s. She was a novelist. She was a short story writer, and she was an essayist. She wrote critical literary criticism essays. She wrote travel literature. She wrote everything. She was a prolific writer, and her archives are held at the University of Toronto. And this, I'm captivated by Yiddish handwriting. I love it, and this is hers. And I thought
this is very much like my father's, and that's why I paid attention to it. Exactly, so much like my father's. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, so that's Chava Rosenfarb. Yeah. And I'm looking in the chat now. Yes, Leonard Sutzkever. I didn't even talk. How could I not talk about Sutzkever? Avram Sutzkever, one of these members of Young Vilna, one of the most prominent members who ends up surviving the war, as we know. He survives in the Vilna ghetto. I'm sorry. He is part of what's called the Paper Brigade. They rescue the papers and the archives at the Vilna Institute, at the YIVO Institute, and he's part of he really saves. He and Shmerka Kaczerginski, who's another one of these members of Young Vilna, they survived the war in the Vilna ghetto. They are part of the Paper Brigade, this group that saves these archives. They're part of the effort to get these archives to New York and to regenerate YIVO in New York. It's a remarkable story. There's a film about it, actually. And he's a central poet, and certainly he goes on to edit a journal until his death in rather recently, I think, in the 2000s, in Israel. He goes on to be a Yiddish poet in Israel, an editor of a journal, and just a really important figure on the Yiddish scene for many, many decades. Yeah. So I'm neglected to talk about Sutzkever, but there you go. And I just want, Talia asked who was the writer of the poem about Vilna. So I mentioned two, Moshe Kulbach, and I will put that, Moshe Kulbach, and the other one was Lazer Wolf. Those are just two of the poets we actually looked at tonight. Yeah, there's a new film out called Black Honey about Avram Sutzkever, Black Honey, and it's been, the Yiddish Book Center did a few online viewing screenings, and I'm sure you'll see it in some of the Jewish film festivals as they circulate. There's actually a film now, the Toronto Jewish Film Festival, which is on now, has a film called Muranov, which is about the Muranov neighborhood in Warsaw, which was the Jewish neighborhood. Today it's where the Nazis put the Warsaw Ghetto, and today it's where the Pauline Museum is, and it's a really interesting neighborhood. I think there's a new revived Yiddish theater there now. It's a really interesting neighborhood, and yeah, you can see that film Muranov. Get a taste of Muranov today. So,
does Laser live in Thornhill today?
You may as well. No, Lazer Wolf. I believe he was killed in World War II. I think he died in 1943.
I think we'll call it an evening. This has been great. I know we could go on for a long time, and we're really looking forward to next week.
Likewise.
I mean, it's obviously there's just such a wealth of things to talk about and learn. But this has been really fascinating, and I see people applauding and smiling. So I know we're all feeling the same way. So. Again, I'll leave this open for a few minutes if anybody wants to scroll back up in the chat to find the link to the poems, which was posted at 8:13, or
I'll put it there one more time.
The link to the recording of last week's that was posted at just around 7:36, and this one's been recorded as well. So this will be up on our YouTube channel, and that'll show up in your email in the coming week. Will you have more for us to read? Are you going to send us more readings for next week? Or?
I might, yeah. I'm going to send you a couple of things to read on Zuni Maud and Yossel Kotler, who had this puppet theater called Modikat, which is a combination of their last names, Zuni Maud and Yossel Kotler. I'm going to send you something on that. I'm going to send you something on the Soviet Yiddish avant-garde. We'll talk more about them. We'll look at some art next week. And I may select another poem or two from the Americans, where working in mostly in New York, but of course other places too. We'll see. But yes, I'll send something your way.
Excellent. So everybody, just watch your email if you've registered for this program. You'll get those materials sent to you. So again, thank you
so much.
We look forward to another session next week.
Thank you all.
Thanks everyone. Good night.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I didn't talk. Is that the right way to say it?
Good Woche. Yeah. I didn't hear you. Yeah. Good Woche. Have a good week. Yeah.
Good Woche.
Good Woche. Yeah. Beautiful.